Welcome back to another crochet tutorial with Cozy Rosie UK. Today I am sharing with you the Strawberry Sunday corner to corner square. This is a 12-inch square, but on top of this, as a little bonus, I'm going to be sharing with you how to transform this square pattern into a full corner to corner blanket as well later on in the video. The first part of the pattern is the same regardless of whether you're making a blanket or a square, so follow along for the first few rows and I'll let you know where to skip ahead for all the blanket details. Before we get started, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and of course the notification bell so you never miss out another one of my crochet patterns or tutorials again. If you're not familiar with corner to corner, instead of working in rows, we work in rows in this direction. So it grows wider rather than getting longer first and foremost. So for our square, we're going to work out until we reach the size that we want along one of these edges. And then we're going to work to decrease across both sides of the square to bring it back to the point here at the top of our square. When you lay it to look like a square, it gives you these diagonal lines, which really sets this pattern on its own. I've made this corner to corner design using my Strawberry Sunday stitch. I absolutely love this stitch combination. You have granny stitch, granny spike stitch and V stitches all worked in rows to give you this kind of unique boxy but lightly textured look. I mean, from the side, I just love spike stitches, as you know, so it really is a beautiful square. This square is being released as part of a crochet along, and I'll pop all the details of that into the description box. There is the opportunity to purchase all of the square designs that feature in that crochet along in a little bundle. So I've popped that into the description box for you below. So the materials that I'm using for this tutorial, I'm going to recreate this square for you. So for colour A, I'm using Paint Box Yarns Simply Aran, and this is in shade paper. Oh no, it's not paper white, it's champagne white, which is 202. I have grabbed this out of my scrap bag, hence why there's a lot of yarn already off. And to make it even worse, this is the alternative colour that I'm using for the contrast, which is Candy Floss Pink, which is shade number 249. So Aran is about an equivalent to a worsted weight yarn, a size 4 yarn. So for that reason, I'm going to be using my Furls Streamline wooden hook. I think this is maple. Or is that maple? I can't remember. But this is a 5mm hook I'm going to be using today. If you've never used a Furls hook, I really like them because, especially the wood ones, because they get faster as you do, and they have a nice point which helps you get through those stitches when it's a little bit tricky. On top of your hook and your yarn, you are going to need a darning needle and a pair of scissors. I'm not sure where mine have gone right now. I'm going to change colours every 3 rows to get this effect, and I think it gives you a nice wide stripe of colours. You can of course change colour wherever you like, or even make it in a solid colour because the texture does speak for itself. So gather all of your materials and let's get started. Regardless of whether you're working a blanket or you are working this square, you can follow these rows with me all the way up to the end of this white section here. That's actually the midway point. If I fold it in half, you can see. And I'm going to explain to you how to create a blanket with this stitch pattern later on in the video. So beginning with colour A, I'm going to make a magic circle. So I just wrap it around my fingers, forming a cross at the back and parallel lines at the front. With my hook, I go under the front, grab the back, bring it through and twist it up as I come. And then I'm grabbing that back loop and just bringing that through. There are multiple different ways of making a magic circle and it's entirely up to you which way you do. This is the way I learnt and it's now quick for me. I'm going to do that again for you just in case you want to try this technique. So I simply wrap the yarn around, bringing the working yarn to the back, secure it with my 4th finger. So at the back I have a cross and at the front I have parallel lines. Come under the front line, grab that back one, I bring it through, twist it so it has a twist, grab that back yarn, bring it through the loop on my hook, bring my hands out, and it's pretty much ready to go. Just going to untwist this tail, and then I make sure that my tail is on this side, away from my working yarn. Well, and keep my working yarn out of the way. And that's it, ready to go. Once you've made your magic circle, if you don't want to make it a magic circle, you can simply make a chain of 4 and slip stitch to that first chain to begin. From here, we're going to start by making a chain of 4. So we yarn over, bring our hook through. So that's 1, 2, 3, and 4. This chain 4 counts as a US double crochet and a chain 1. We're then going to work into the center of the ring, whichever one we've created. And we're beginning by yarning over, ready to work the first of 3 US double crochets. So we yarn over, we're inserting our hook into the middle of that ring. I am working over my tail at the same time. Going to yarn over, bring it back through, tighten everything up a bit, yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over and pull through 2. So that creates our double crochet. I just realized that my tail is now on the wrong side, so I'm making sure that I've got my ring that I'm working into untwisted. We're going to make a further 2 double crochets, so that's 1, and I'm just working this final one into here in the same way. So we have 1, 2, 3 double crochets, and if your end is becoming twisted around, you can just pull that back out. We're going to make a chain 1. Once you've made that chain 1, we're going to yarn over and work a further double crochet back into our magic ring to end row 1. So it should be looking a little bit like this. And I'm simply going to pull on this tail to close that ring nice and tightly to end row 1. From here we are going to be working in rows, so we're going to be turning at the end of each row. I always do my chain before I turn. It doesn't matter which way you do it. We go into so we have that beginning chain 4 that we made, which counts as a double crochet and a chain 1. We have 3 double crochets, a further chain 1, and then our last double crochet at the end of row 1. Going into row 2, we begin with our chain of 4. I then turn, and we're going to work into this first chain 1 space underneath our chain 4. This chain 4 continues to count as a double crochet and a chain 1. So into that chain 1 space, we're going to work our V-stitch. So we yarn over, insert our hook into that chain 1 space, working 1 double crochet, a chain 1, and a further double crochet back into that same chain 1 space. So this is our V-stitch that we've just made, creating another chain 1 space there. We're then going to work a chain of 1. We're going to skip these 3 double crochets, working into this chain 1 space over here, and into this chain 1 space we're yarning over, ready to work a V-stitch. So that's 1 double crochet, a chain 1, and a further double crochet back into that same chain 1 space. We're going to make a chain 1, and then we're working a final double crochet into that same chain 1 space again. So at the end of row 2, we have a chain 4, which creates a chain 1 space there. We have our V-stitch, so double crochet, chain 1 and a V-stitch. We made a chain 1 in between. Into that final chain 1 space, we have a V-stitch, a chain 1, and another double crochet. Going into row 3, we start with a chain of 4. That's 1, 2, 3, and 4. We're going to turn. We're going to keep our tail at the bottom, and we're working into that chain 1 space underneath our chain 4. And this time we're going to be working 3 double crochets. So we yarn over, insert into the chain 1 space, working 1, yarn over for number 2, yarn over again. We're working a 3rd double crochet into that same chain 1 space. We then chain 1. We're skipping over the V-stitch and working into the chain 1 space in between. Ready to work a further 3 double crochets into that chain 1 space. So that's 1, 2, and 3. We then chain 1. We're going to skip this V-stitch and work into the chain 1 space after it. And we're working 3 double crochets. So that's 1, 2, and 3. We then chain 1 and we end this row working back into the same chain 1 space, working a further double crochet. So at the end of row 3, you should have 3 double crochets or granny stitches, and you should have 4 chain 1 spaces. You've got 1, 2, 3, and there's number 4. Now, as you can see, as we're moving up, row 1, we had 1 kind of block. Row 2, we've got 2. Row 3, we've got 3. Now, if you are aiming to work in different rows and changing colours, we would change colour at the end of row 3. So I'm going to change to colour B, which for me is that candy floss pink. It's up to you whether you change colour working into the last of those stitches that we made. So I've just pulled back that last stitch of row 3. I'm going to work half of my double crochet and then bring in my new colour just by placing the tail at the back over my hook and bringing it through. And then I'm ready to start row 4 with my new colour. So for row 4, we begin with a chain 4. So that's 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I'm going to fasten off my incredibly long tail. So fasten off colour A just by making a little snip. And it just means that I've only got one colour attached at a time. You can work over these ends if you want to, but we are adding an edging, which makes it really easy to hide your ends into the edging. So we've done our chain 4. I'm going to turn, so I'm working back along this row. And we begin row 4 by working 3 double crochets into that first chain 1 space underneath our chain 4. So we yarn over and work 3 double crochets. We make a chain of 1, and for the remainder of this row we're going to work our granny spike stitch, which is why we have a V-stitch underneath. So we're going to yarn over, and into that next chain 1 space we begin with a double crochet. We're then going to work a long double crochet 2 rows below. So this is 1 row below, this is 2 rows below, and we're actually aiming for that space in the middle of our V-stitch. So we yarn over, we're inserting our hook not into the same space but another row below. So that's row 1, which would be here. We're going 2 rows below. We yarn over, bring our loop up to the height that we're working to. We yarn over, pull through those first 2 loops, yarn over and pull through the next 2. We're then going to complete our granny spike stitch back into that first chain 1 space that we worked into. So we yarn over. We're not working where we've just worked, just behind. You've got the remainder of that chain 1 space and you're just working into there. Of course, we make our chain 1 and then we're skipping over our 3 double crochets to work into that next chain 1 space, and we're working another granny spike. So we yarn over and work our double crochet into the chain 1 space as normal, followed by a long double crochet 2 rows below to create that spike. So we yarn over, we're inserting into the middle of that V-stitch from 2 rows below. We yarn over, bring our loop up, yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2. You're aiming to work to the same height that you're creating, so these shouldn't be overly tight because we don't want to create too much tension in these spikes. As you can see from this version here, where you can't, so there's no tension. So we're looking to make this spike stitch here not loose enough to not distort the square. Once you've worked your long double crochet, we end by working a double crochet back into that same chain 1 space. We worked the first one into, we chain 1, and we end the row working 3 double crochets into that next chain 1 space right at the end. So that's 1, 2, and 3 all into that same chain 1 space. We chain 1 and work a final double crochet into that same final chain 1 space. So at the end of round 4 we have our chain 1 and a granny stitch, a chain 1 in between, and then we do our spike stitch into each chain 1 space across to the last, where we're working our granny stitch, a chain 1 and a double crochet into that last chain 1 space. Going into row 5, we begin with our chain of 4. We turn and we're working into that chain 1 space underneath our chain 4, working a V-stitch. So we yarn over, make a double crochet, a chain 1 and another double crochet into that same chain 1 space. We chain 1, we skip over our granny stitch, working into the chain 1 spaces. We are working a V-stitch, so that's a double crochet, chain 1 and another double crochet. We chain 1 to step over our granny spike stitch, working into that chain 1 space again, and we're working a V-stitch followed by a chain 1 into each chain 1 space across to the last. So that's a double crochet, chain 1 and another double crochet to create our V-stitch. We chain 1 and that brings us to our last. Into our last chain 1 space we are working a V-stitch, so double crochet, chain 1 and a double crochet. We then make a chain 1 and work a final double crochet into that last chain 1 space. And then in row 5 we have 5 V-stitches and our chain 1s at the end. Going into row 6, we're continuing with colour B. We start with our chain of 4 into this first chain 1 space. We're back to our granny stitch row. So we're yarning over after our chain 4 to work 3 double crochets. That's 1, 2 and 3. We chain 1, we step across our V-stitch, working into the chain 1 spaces between them, working 3 double crochets. 2, oops, and 3. We chain 1 to step over the next V-stitch and work into the chain 1 space between them, working a further 3 double crochets. We chain 1 and we're back to work it. Oh, not if I put my hook there. And we're continuing to work into the chain 1 spaces between these V-stitches, placing 3 double crochets. We chain 1 in between, got another chain 1 space, so we're working 3 double crochets. We chain 1 and that brings us back to our final V-stitch and chain 1. We're not working into the V-stitch, we're working into the last chain 1 space, and we're working 3 double crochets, 2 and 3. We're going to make our chain 1 and work our final double crochet into that same chain 1 space. So at the end of row 6 we have 6 granny stitches and we have our double crochet at each end with a chain 1 space as well. At the end of row 6 we are changing back to colour A. You can, again, if you want, just undo that last one and change back to colour A. I'm just going to place that over my hook and bring it through, and we're ready to start row 7, but in colour A. I'm going to fasten off colour B, making sure I've left a long enough tail to weave in. So for row 7 we begin with a chain of 4. We are going to leave those ends there. I'm not going to weave them in. I'll catch them when we do the edge. We begin row 7. We are working our spike stitch row, but we begin with a 3 double crochet into that first chain 1 space, right underneath that chain 4. We make a chain 1 to skip over our 3 double crochet, and we're back to our granny spike stitches into the chain 1 space. So we yarn over, work our double crochet. We're then going to work our long double crochet into that chain 1 space 2 rows below. So we yarn over, insert our hook into the middle of our V-stitch from 2 rows below, yarn over, bring our loop up, pull through 2, pull through 2, and we're working another double crochet into that chain 1 space that we started in, just 1 row below. We make a chain 1 in between, and we're going to repeat this all the way across into these chain 1 spaces all the way to the last. I'll work one more with you just to be safe. So we're yarning over, inserting into the next chain 1 space, working our double crochet. We're then going to yarn over, ready for our long double crochet into that chain 1 space. So that's row 1, 2 rows below, into that middle of that V-stitch. So that's 1 long double crochet. We then work another double crochet into the chain 1 space from the previous row. Don't forget to make your chain 1. And we're going to repeat that all the way across, so 3 more times, and I'll meet you at our final chain 1 space, ready to end row 7. Make sure you've worked your final chain 1 and you have your spike stitches into each of those chain 1 spaces across to that last final chain 1 space. Into our final chain 1, we are working 3 double crochets. So that's 1, 2, and 3. We chain 1 and we're working a final double crochet into that last chain 1 space. So at the end of row 7, we have our 2 double crochets with our chain 1s. We then have 3 double crochets, and then into each of the remaining chain 1 spaces we have our spike stitch. Going into row 8, we begin with our chain of 4, and row 8 is our V-stitch row. So we begin by working into that first chain 1 space under our chain 4, working our V-stitch, so a double crochet, a chain 1 and another double crochet, worked into that same chain 1 space. We then make our chain of 1, and then working into each chain 1 space across, we are working 1 V-stitch, followed by a chain 1. We're just going to repeat that all the way across to our last chain 1 space at the end of the row, and that's where I'm going to meet you. So continue across, working 1 V-stitch followed by a chain 1 into each of these chain 1 spaces across, and I will meet you at the end of row 8. So once you've worked across and you have just that final chain 1 space, you should already have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 V-stitches, and we're working a final V-stitch into that last chain 1 space. We make our chain 1 and we work a final double crochet into that last chain 1 space. We're to lay this flat, you can see that our square is forming on a diagonal. It's obviously nice to look at it at this angle, but you can actually see that we are creating a square. It won't be absolutely perfect because obviously these are chain 4s, but you can see that the shape is forming, which is always exciting. So for row 9, we start with our chain of 4, 3 and 4. We're working our 3 double crochet row. So we yarn over, we're working 3 double crochets into that same chain 1 space just underneath our chain 4. We we then make a chain 1. We're skipping over our V-stitch, working into the chain 1 spaces between them, and into each of these chain 1 spaces across, we are working a 3 double crochet and making a chain 1 at the end. We're going to repeat this all the way across this row, working those 3 double crochets and a chain 1 up to that final chain 1 space. So continue across, working 3 double crochets and a chain 1 into each of these chain 1 spaces between your V-stitches, and I'll meet you for our final chain space. So once you've worked all the way across to your final chain 1 space, working in between those V-stitches, we should have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 3 double crochets. We're going to work our final and 9th one into that last chain 1 space. We're just going to ignore the fact that someone has tied these yarns together. So that's 1, 2, we're going to ignore that for a moment, and 3. We chain 1 and work a final double crochet into that last chain space. I've paused here because we have worked 3 rows in this colour, so it is time to change back to colour B. So my final stitch I'm going to be finishing with colour B, just by placing that over with the tail at the back and pulling through. I'm just going to make a chain 1 because we are going to pause here. So at the end of row 9 you should have 10 chain 1 spaces and those 9 3 double crochets. For rows 10 to 12 you're going to repeat rows 7 to 9. So you'll have 3 rows in your colour B, and then for rows 13 to 15 you're going to repeat rows 7 to 9 again in colour A. At that point you should have reached a 12-inch measurement across the base of your square. You'll have a total row count of 15, and you should have another section of pink and another section of white in this case, or colour A and colour B. So you work in colour B next and then colour A, and I'm going to meet you then to talk about moving on to either squaring off your square or going on to make a blanket. So I'll see you once you've repeated rows 7 to 9 2 times, once in colour B and once in colour A. I'll see you in a moment. So once you have worked those repeats of row 7 to 9 until you have a total of 15 rows, you should be able to measure from the beginning tail that we have up to the edge. You may need to get it so it's actually straight, because as you can see mine's a little bit wavy. From here to here should measure the square size you're looking to make, which in this case is 12 inches. If you wanted to go on to make a blanket, you can continue to repeat rows 7 to 9 until this measurement is as wide as the blanket that you're looking to create. There are lots of standard blanket sizes. I've popped a link in the top right hand corner for you to view my table of standard blanket sizes. My favourite is of course a nice lap gown, which is 36, so you're looking to get a measurement of 36 across. Another favourite is a throw sized, that would be a measurement of 54 inches across. If you're looking to make a rectangular blanket rather than a square one, if you go to the timestamp which is marked increasing the blanket length, I will explain how you turn it into a rectangle, and it's worked by only increasing on one side. And then after you've increased the length that you want, you can join us again for the next section. You have to skip backwards and forwards, sorry, which is marked squaring off or completing your blanket. For those of us that are making this square, we're going to continue on where we are decreasing on both edges of our square. I'm going to change back to colour B in that final stitch of row 15 so that we can decrease on, oh no, I did pull a stitch out, so that we can decrease for our first row. And I still forgot to change colour. There we are. So I'm going to change back to colour B. And this is row 16 of our square, and it's the same steps that you would follow to complete your blanket as well. So we're going to make a chain of 4, going to turn, and the way that we stop increasing, as in working to make it wider, is we stop working and skip the chain 1 space underneath our chain 4. we're going to instead work into that next chain 1 space. So we're skipping this one and working directly into that one, and we are working our granny spike stitch in this row. So we yarn over, we're skipping that first chain 1 space under our chain 4 and working into this one, placing our first double crochet. We're then working our long double crochet into that V-stitch underneath. To finish, we work our next double crochet into that same chain 1 space. So the difference is really obvious because obviously we have not worked our 3 double crochets like we were before into that first chain 1 space. Instead, we've made our chain 4, skipped that chain space and worked straight into that chain 1 space between our 3 double crochets from the previous row. Did I do a chain 1? No. So we chain 1. And we're just continuing to repeat across, working our granny spike stitch into each of the chain 1 spaces. So we do that long double crochet into that V-stitch 2 rows below. And we're going to repeat that all the way across, making sure we do a chain 1 in between. We're going to meet you ready to work our final chain 1 space. So continue to repeat that all the way across, and I'll meet you for our final chain 1 space. So once you've worked all the way across and you have just that final chain 1 space left, making sure you have done that last chain 1, we are simply going to work 1 double crochet into that last chain 1 space. It's not going to look super obvious right now that we are no longer increasing, but at the end of the next row, it will be really become apparent. So going into row 17, we begin with a chain of 4. Going to turn, and once again, we're skipping the chain 1 space underneath our chain 4. So we're actually going to work into this one here. We're going to make our V-stitch. So we work our double crochet, turn to my hook, chain 1 and a further double crochet, followed by a chain 1. And you can see once again, we have skipped that stitch underneath, working into the next one. We're just going to repeat our V-stitch all the way across with a chain 1 in between, all the way across to our final chain 1 space. And that's where I'm going to meet you. So continue across, working your V-stitch, followed by a chain 1, and I will meet you at this lovely large space here. So once you've worked all the way across, making your V-stitches into each chain 1 space across, we are left with this final space. Making sure you've done your final chain 1, we are simply working a double crochet into that last space. It should now, if you imagine, oh my God, it's now becoming a little bit more apparent that we are, if I straighten that end up, we are literally creating a flat edge on this side of our square, but we're also doing that on the other side as well. So we are bringing in and working in towards here, reducing the amount of blocks in our row. So for row 18, we are making a chain of 4. We are turning. We are skipping that chain 1 space underneath, and we are simply working 3 double crochets into each chain 1 space across to our final chain 1 space. Make sure you do those chain 1s in between, and we're working in between our V-stitches as always, all the way across to this final space, and that's where I'm going to meet you, ready to share the final repeats for you to get your square finished off. Once you've worked your 3 double crochets all the way across, working in between those V-stitches over to that final chain 1 space, we simply end by working a final double crochet into that last chain 1 space. So from this point, we are going to be repeating rows 16 to 18 3 times. We're going to work rows 19 to 21 with colour A. We're then going to repeat them repeat rows 16 to 18 again, but this time in colour B, and then rows 25 to 27 with colour A once again, and then I'm going to join you for row 28 and 29 to go on to our edging. It's still not very obvious from this angle, but when you position it as a square, as this the corner, you'll see that your edge is starting to be created on both sides. It won't be perfectly flat, that's why we're going to put an edging on, but it should be neat enough to look a little bit like that, and we should be getting flatter. So the main thing to remember is you're repeating rows 16 to 18. So our next row is going to be our spike stitch, and the main thing to remember is we are no longer working into those chain 1 spaces underneath our beginning chain 4s, so the number of blocks in our rows will be reducing. I'm going to meet you once you've repeated rows 16 to 18 a further 3 times, changing colour after each 3 rows, and I'll meet you for our final 2 rows. So once you have completed all of those repeats on your square, we are going to work. I'm going to change back to colour B to finish off the final few rows and then work my edging. So row 28 begins with a repeat of row 16. So we're making our chain of 4. We skip that chain space underneath and we are working our spike stitch row for the final time. And there's only a measly 2 to work. We are then of course ending with our double crochet into that last space, ready for our final row. We're going to work row 29 beginning with a chain of 4. We're going to skip that chain 1 space underneath, but in the middle of this chain 1 space we're going to work a double crochet. We're then going to work a US treble crochet. So we wrap the yarn around the hook twice, insert, bring up a 4th loop. We're going to yarn over, pull through 2. If my yarn wouldn't split, there we are. Pull through 2 again, and for a 3rd time, pull through 2. We then work a further double crochet into that same chain 1 space, make our chain 1, working a double crochet in the last. Now what that does is just gives us a taller end to that last corner, effectively, of our square. Otherwise it looks a bit round and doesn't work very well. So we have now completed our 12-inch square. It may be a little bit wonky or pulling to one side. Mine doesn't do that particularly badly, but the edging is going to help. Now, if you wanted to join these squares together to create, how was I going to do it? I was going to do that. A really cool colour effect. If you imagine there wasn't the edging there, you could join them and get almost a mitered effect. You can use these ends to sew them together using the same colour. But if you're going to be using this square in a granny square blanket or anything else, I would simply either weave your ends in or be lazy as I'm going to be and work over them. You can take the time to secure them together just by making a double knot, making sure that you don't lose your chain space. So personally, I would just gently knot them together. Just gives you a bit more security. If you're not weaving these ends in, just go all the way around all the edges, creating a double knot in each of your ends. And this will just give you a little bit more security. I know we're not supposed to knot things and we're supposed to weave things in properly, but I like to make sure that things aren't going to come undone in the wash. And this, for me, is the safest way. I'm not doing exceptionally tight knots, and I'm still going to weave these ends in. I'm just going to bury them a little bit into my edging at the same time without having to worry about the chains coming undone whilst we're working. Now, unusually, we are not beginning in the corner of our blanket. or the corner of our square when it comes to working our edging, because this final group of 3 becomes a corner, so we're not actually starting our edging in the corner. All we're going to do is simply work all the way around this square and then placing a corner into what should be the corner. We've got 2 dodgy corners on here because obviously we have worked from corner to corner, so we need to make sure that when we reach our beginning tail, which is going to be this one here, we need to make sure we add a good corner there. So we're going to make our chain of 1, and we're going to start by working back into the base of that stitch we've just finished with by working a single crochet, and we're simply going to evenly single crochet across all of these row ends. As you can see, some are bigger than others because that's obviously where we've not increased. So we just have to be careful about where we're placing them and where our row ends are. We're not working like that. We have to keep it straight when we're doing this. And I would recommend that you work into the chain, not around it. We're probably going to need 2 to 3 stitches per row end. So we're evenly working through the chains, not around them, so that you actually get the base of the colour, because when we get to a row end here, we can work into that space and then we can work into the chain and over those ends, and it would just make the edge that little bit neater. So I'm going to be placing roughly 2 to 3 single crochets across these row ends, and I'm working into the chains so that it does appear that even when you're working across the other colours, you're working into it rather than around it, which just gives you a neater edge. So continue to work all the way down your row ends, evenly spacing your single crochets, making sure that you're not stretching the square too much or bringing it in too much. And I'm going to meet you when we reach this first corner of our square, so we can get that nice and neat as well. You can work over your ends as I am as well, so that will help with your weaving in, make it a little bit easier. And I'll see you in a moment when you reach that first corner. So I've worked all the way down from here, this is where we started, all the way down to the first corner. I've actually worked the first stitch into what is the corner, and my knot is just behind where we changed colour. So I'm going to work a second single crochet into that same stitch. I'm going to make a chain of 2, then I'm going to rotate so we can work along this next edge. Before we do that, we need to finish this corner, so I'm going to work back into the same space again, working a further 2 single crochets. That will give a really defined corner to this square. There's no mistaking that's where the corner is. And then we can continue working across these row ends. I'm weaving my ends as I go, or working over them. And just repeating, working 2 or 3 single crochets across these row ends and working through those chains, because it really does make it look a lot neater than working around, especially when you're using such contrasting colours. So continue to work up to our next corner, which is going to be our beginning tail, and that's where I'm going to meet you to work our next corner. So once you've worked all the way down your next edge, we've reached where we started our project, and the actual magic circle itself is there, and that's the ideal place to pop your hook into if you can get your hook through. We are simply going to work the same corner again, so we do 2 single crochets, a chain of 2, and a further 2 single crochets into that same magic ring that we started with. We can tighten that back up once again, and it just gives us a really neat corner. We can then continue working across these row ends all the way to our next corner, which is actually going to be the second chain in that group. It's not going to be at the base here, it's going to be there. So continue working into your row ends and I'll meet you for our next corner. So once you've worked all the way along your next edge, I have got some ends in the way, sorry, and I've got, this is the chain 4 from this block here. I've worked into one, I'm in the second chain of that 4 chain block, and this is where I'm going to work my corner. So I'm working my secondary single crochet, making a chain of 2, and then working an additional 2 single crochets into that chain. Whoops. And it's just really helping to define our corners and keeping them really nice and neat all the way around this square. You may find that you need to move your corner back a space, forward a space. You can adjust their placement so that you're happy with how your square looks. But then once again, we are working all the way around to our next corner and remembering that our corner was not where we started. Unusually, we've actually started into our round, but that treble crochet we made marks our final corner. So I'm going to meet you in your final group of 3 stitches to work our final corner into that treble crochet. I've worked that single crochet into the first one, and I'm going to work my corner. I'm going to work my corner into the top of that treble crochet that we made. So that's 2 single crochets, a chain 2, and a further 2 single crochets all into that same stitch. 1 and 2. Might not feel like that's the corner, but it is the best place for you to place your corner. Once you've worked that corner, you have a nice, easy couple of stitches to work before you're back to where we originally started, and that's where we can join. Just slip stitch to join. I'm going to make a little chain 1. And then we can fasten off. And that is, I just wanted to show you that looks like it came around there, but that's because it does need a light blocking because mine is a little bit curly, but that's just, my tension is not great today. A little bit under the weather and it does affect my tension. I don't know if you've ever noticed that with yourself as well. So we have nice, beautifully defined corners. Got to sort these ends out because they're irritating me. But we have nice corners. I might undo that chain because that's irritating me because it takes away from that beautiful corner that we've created. So working your corner into that treble just gives you a nice end with nice straight edges. It is going to look a little bit gappy at the ends of your rows, but that's why if you work into your chains, it just makes the square a bit more solid and defines those edges a little bit more. So thank you so much for joining me for this tutorial to make either your Strawberry Sunday corner to corner square or your corner to corner blanket. You can do the same edging for your blanket as well. Easy enough to follow. You're just going to work through your row ends and know where to place your corners. So thank you so much for joining me. I will see you in the next video. Once you've repeated rows 7 to 9 to achieve the width of the blanket that you want, be 36, 48, whatever size blanket you're making, as long as your sides are measuring the total width you want for your blanket to create a rectangle, you will then only increase, as in work into your chain 1 space on one side of your blanket. If you've achieved the width that you want and you wanted to create a square blanket, you can follow the squaring off section of this video and that will allow you to complete your blanket. If you wanted to create a rectangle, we need to increase on only one side of our blanket to achieve the total length you want for your blanket. Make sure that you finished your last repeat on your granny stitch row, and I'm changing back just so it looks the same for the colour changes. I'm changing colour every 3 rows. I'm going to assume that I have achieved the width of the blanket that I want. Obviously I'm just using my square here to show you how to create a rectangle. you would begin your first row of increasing your blanket length using your next colour, working a chain of 4, and you would then not increase on your odd numbered rows. So what that means is we will skip the chain 1 space underneath our chain 4, because this would be considered an odd numbered row, because this is row 1 of increasing the length of our blanket. So we make our chain 4 and we're skipping this space underneath. We're yarning over and we're working our granny spike stitch into the first or the next chain 1 space. So we're skipping this one underneath our chain 4 and we are working our double crochet, our long double crochet into that V stitch 2 rows below, and then working back into that chain 1 space to work our last double crochet. We make our chain 1 and we simply repeat our granny spike stitch all the way across as we have done for our previous rows to create the width of our blanket that we want. The only difference is to make it a rectangle, we are not increasing on this, we're no longer increasing on this side of our blanket. So you see that we've skipped that first chain 1 space and worked our spike into that first V stitch. We're going to continue to repeat our granny spike stitch all the way across, and I'm going to meet you for our final chain 1 space where we will be increasing at the end of this odd numbered row. So just continue to repeat your granny spike stitch all the way across this row till you reach your final chain 1 space, and that's where I'm going to meet you. So once you've worked your granny spike stitch all the way along this row and you've reached your final chain 1 space, we've done our last chain 1. To end the row, we're going to be increasing on this edge of our blanket, which means we're going to work our standard 3 double crochet into that chain 1 space. We make our chain 1 and we work a further double crochet into that chain 1 space as normal. So what you'll have on your odd numbered rows, you'll have your skipped chain 4 space, and then you'll have your increase on one edge. It's up to you to avoid confusion, especially with these earlier rows, if you want to place a stitch marker where you should be skipping. It sounds a bit weird, but it makes sense as you work along to keep an eye on which end you should not be increasing in. It will make sense, I promise. So I don't have to think too much. I've just placed a stitch marker where I've skipped, and when we get back to that stitch marker, I will know where I should be skipping. For row 2, we start with our chain of 4. We turn. So because I don't have a stitch marker here, I'm working the normal beginning of my row. So we start by working our V stitch into that same chain 1 space as our chain 4. Ending with our chain 1. We're then going to work a V stitch into each chain 1 space across with a chain 1 in between. And we're going to repeat that all the way across. So chain 1, sorry, excuse the noise from my stitch marker. I'm going to repeat that all the way across to where we have that marked edge, and that's where I'm going to meet you. So work your final V stitch here, and I'll meet you for this chain 4 space when we get there. So continue across, working that V stitch, and I'll see you in a moment. So once you've worked your V stitch all the way across and you've reached that marked side of your blanket, we are simply going to work a final double crochet into that last chain 1 space to continue working a straight edge where we've marked. So we increase on the unmarked side by working our normal beginning of our row, and then at the end of that row we don't increase. It's the only way to say it. We just work a double crochet, and that will give us a nice flat edge. So going into row 3, it's an odd numbered row. So we start with our chain of 4 and we skip this space underneath, working into that next chain 1 space. So we're yarning over and working skipping that first chain 1 space, working into the next, working our 3 double crochets. So that's 1, 2 and 3. Oops. And we chain 1. And we're going to continue to repeat across, working those 3 double crochets and a chain 1 into each of those chain 1 spaces between our V-stitches. Already you can see that this is going to create a lovely flat edge on this side of this blanket. And although we have a flat edge on this side as well, it's increasing in length on this side, but we're not increasing on the width on this side of our blanket. So continue to repeat, working 3 double crochets into each of your chain 1 spaces across, and I will meet you for our final chain 1 space. Once you've worked your 3 double crochets all the way along and you've reached your final chain 1 space, making sure you've done that last chain 1, we are working at 3 double crochets, that final chain 1 space. We're working a chain 1 and working that final double crochet. So you can see that this edge is continuing to get longer, but the other side of our blanket, if I lay it flat, you can see that it's a nice flat edge and it is no longer increasing in width. I find it useful to have a marked edge just so that we really don't have to think, but it is entirely up to you if you mark that edge. Of course, I'm going to be changing back to colour A. So I'm just going to pop that over and change colour for that final stitch of row 3. And then going into row 4, we start with a chain of 3. No, we don't. Chain of 4. And because we don't have this edge marked, we're going to be increasing on this round. So we're going to start by working 3 double crochets into that same chain 1 space underneath our chain 4. And then we chain 1. We are working, we chain 1. We are working our spike stitch row. So we are working into our chain 1 spaces, working our spike stitch. Just as before, there's no difference here. The only difference is at the beginning of row 4, because we are on an even number, we increase into that first chain 1 space. With the odd numbered rows, well, the unmarked edge or the odd numbered rows, we don't work that first chain 1 space. Of course, make sure I always forget to do my chain 1s in between. And we're just going to continue to repeat that all the way across, working that granny spike stitch into the V-stitch 2 rows below. Going to repeat that all the way across, and because this is our marked edge, when we've worked our final chain 1 space, we're just going to work a double crochet into the end. So continue across and I will meet you for our final chain 1 space. Ooh, spike. Once you've worked all the way across, placing those granny spike stitches, we're back to our marked edge and we are simply going to work a double crochet into that last space, just to continue that flat edge of our blanket. It's so much more visual now that we've worked a few more rows. You can really see that this is continuing to get taller and we're bringing this edge up with us, but we're no longer increasing the width of our blanket and we are creating a rectangle. So for row 5, we begin with our chain of 4. We're turning. This is our marked edge. So we are going to skip this space underneath our chain 4. And this round is our V-stitch round. So we're skipping that first space, working our V-stitch into the next, followed by a chain 1. So we're just replicating what is underneath our hook. If we've increased, if we're working an even numbered row, we would have increased. Or if it's our marked row or an odd numbered row, because we're doing row 5, we skip that chain 1 space underneath our chain 4 and work the row as normal all the way to the end. So we're going to continue to repeat this V-stitch and a chain 1 all the way up. I'm sorry, I'm trying to avoid my stitch marker making noises. So we're going to work our V-stitch all the way up to our final chain 1 space, and that's where I'm going to meet you for the end of row 5. Once we've worked all the way up to the end of row 5, we have that final chain 1 space. You can judge which side you're on as your blanket gets larger. You can see that there is no stitch marker, so we're not decreasing, we're actually increasing in this final stitch, and that's what's underneath as well. You can see that we've worked the full stitch and that chain 1 plus another double crochet, so we're going to replicate that. We're working our V-stitch, a chain 1 and a further double crochet into that chain 1 space. Going into row 6, we start with our chain of 4. As you can see, we've increased into that space in the previous row, so we're going to work into the chain 1 space underneath because it's an even numbered row. We're working our 3 double crochet row, so we're simply working 3 double crochets and a chain 1 into that first chain 1 space underneath our chain 4, and we're working 3 double crochets into each chain 1 space across. Don't forget to do your chain 1 after your 3 double crochets. Continue to work that all the way across to your final chain 1 space. You'll see your stitch marker or the fact that you have no increase, but we'll discuss that a little bit further in a moment when you reach the end of this row, and I will meet you there ready to discuss your repeats and how to achieve the blanket size you want. So once you've worked all the way across and you have just that final stitch there, you can see there is no increase, it's a bigger hole. We are simply working a double crochet into that final space. So you can probably really see very clearly now that we have very much a rectangle. Yes, it is on a bias, so, and I can't even fit it on screen now. You've got a flat edge on both sides, so you're now creating a rectangle. And if you look at it from where we were positioning it before, it looks a little bit odd actually, but you've got a completely flat bottom of your blanket, and you now have a side being created, so it's really clear. You can, of course, move your stitch marker up if you're finding that useful to know when not to increase, or you can just follow what's underneath your hook when you're there. You're going to continue to increase the height of your blanket now, and the side you want to measure to achieve the correct finished size or height of your blanket is your longer edge. So if you're making a lapgan and you've got your 36 inches across the base here, you're going to want this longer edge to measure 48 inches to finish, or 66 if you're making a throw. And it is as simple as that. Once you've achieved the total length that you want your blanket to be, because the width is already done, this is to increase the length until this side, the longest side of your blanket, measures the total height you want. I would recommend that you end on a repeat of row 3 or row 6, and then you can continue on to squaring off / completing your blanket, which is a separate timestamp. And it is as simple as that. You just continue to repeat rows 1 to 6 now that are time stamped here for you under increasing your length.